afternoon, everyone. My name is Holly Huang, and I'm a Community Outreach Coordinator with the Howard County Office of Human Rights and Equity. And I'm so pleased to be able to welcome you all to our webinar this afternoon, which we are hosting in recognition of April as National Fair Housing Month. Before we get started, I want to share a bit about our office and the work that we do. And so the Howard County Office of Human Rights and Equity is an entity of Howard County government that seeks to eradicate discrimination, increase equal opportunity, and protect and promote human rights here in Howard County. Our office houses 3 units: the Investigative Unit, the Equity and Restorative Practices Unit, and the Community Outreach Unit. The Investigative Unit, which we'll be hearing from today, investigates and processes claims of unlawful discrimination in Howard County. This unit also enforces the Howard County Human Rights Code and conducts hearings on issues affecting the protection and promotion of human rights. The Equity and Restorative Practices Unit uses an equity-centered lens to infuse concepts of equity in the county's service delivery, decision-making, and distribution of resources. They seek to ensure a shared organizational understanding of racial equity and social justice by supporting transformational change among Howard County government departments and staff. This is done through equitable practices, policies, and procedures. And finally, the Community Outreach Unit, that's the unit I serve on, is responsible for increasing the presence of the office throughout the Howard County community. And we accomplish this by putting forward programs just like this, by providing trainings and workshops, listening sessions, and events to government agencies, organizations, and community members around topics related to racial equity, social justice, and human relations. And at this time, I would like to introduce to you one of our speakers for today's event, Mr. Todd Givens, Sr., who serves as Lead Investigator at the Howard County Office of Human Rights and Equity. Mr. Givens came to the Howard County, Maryland Office of Human Rights as an investigator in 2014. During his tenure with the office, he has advocated for cooperation between the Office of Human Rights, employers, and employees to advance equal opportunity in the workplace. He has also carried out the office's mission by enforcing the laws within OHRE's jurisdiction, along with advancing concepts of diversity and inclusion. And prior to coming to this office, Mr. Givens has served as an attorney advisor for several state and federal agencies, where he worked on a broad range of civil and criminal matters. Mr. Givens also previously served as a state's attorney for Howard County, Maryland. Mr. Givens has received a bachelor's in communications from Hampton University, a JD from the North Carolina Central School of Law, and is a certified mediator. And now I'd like to hand it over to Mr. Givens.
Oh, thank you very much, Holly, for that introduction. I certainly appreciate it. And also, I didn't come by myself today. Also, is Mr. Kevin Logan, and he's one of the investigators in our office as well. And we are part of the investigative unit for Office of Human Rights and Equity. And as you mentioned before, there's 3 separate units, Equity and Restorative Practices and Community Outreach in our investigative unit. And basically what we do primarily in our investigative unit, we investigate allegations of discrimination in several different areas. And it'd be housing, whether it be employment, whether it be law enforcement, whether it be financing, or whether it be public accommodations. And public accommodations are those private or public entities that essentially open themselves up to the public, like the mall or a store or something like that. So we investigate allegations of discrimination in all of those areas. We wanted to talk a little bit about housing today, since today is this month is National Fair Housing Month. So we wanted to talk a little bit about what we do in the housing area and sort of Fair Housing Act and and what we do as far as investigating complaints of discrimination. So thank you for having us on.
Of course, and we are so happy to have you both here with us this afternoon. And to get started on our conversation, I wanted to ask about the Fair Housing Act. Could you talk a little bit about what the act is and what it does?
Sure. So essentially, the Fair Housing Act is federal law, and it can be found in at 42 United States Code, Section 3601. And so essentially what it does, it prevents discrimination in those areas where folks have access to housing, or grant access to housing. such as landlords or real estate companies or banks. So it prevents discrimination by those entities in housing related transactions. And housing related transactions essentially includes the sale, rental, or financing of a dwelling. So essentially what it does in more practical sense, it helps folks that who are maybe renting or buying a home or trying to get a mortgage. It prevents discrimination in those areas. And also just wanted to add that a dwelling is essentially the whole or part of a building or structure or mobile home or manufactured housing that's intended to be used as an occupancy as a residence for one or more families.
Okay, thanks so much for the introduction. It certainly gives us an idea of all the topics that we're going to be going through today. And so could you also talk a little bit about what discrimination housing is, what that might entail or look like?
Sure. So essentially, in a broad sense, what housing discrimination is, it's essentially any attempt to prohibit or limit free or fair housing choice based on a membership in a protected class. And we'll talk a little more about protected class shortly. But essentially, in a more practical sense, housing discrimination can, often look in take shape in several forms. So for example, it could be a refusal to rent or sell or negotiate for the rental or purchase of housing or otherwise making housing available. That's one form. Another form might be advertising or making a statement that indicates a preference, a limitation, or discrimination. For example, if you saw an ad that said no housing vouchers, or you saw an ad that said no African Americans, or that sort of thing. So, or we only want certain people to apply. So that could be another example. Another possible example is falsely stating that housing is unavailable to show or rent or purchase. So these are some of the practical this is what possible discrimination looks like. Other examples, for example, steering somebody either into or away from certain neighborhoods. Like, for example, if somebody just took me, for example, to all of the African American neighborhoods because they felt like I might be more comfortable there, or they steered me away from certain neighborhoods that weren't African American. So those are examples of what housing providers are not supposed to do. And essentially, it's almost like a fairness sort of thing. So you don't want to set terms and conditions that are less favorable than offered to any other renter or buyer. And so essentially, we always advise landlords and basically treat everybody the same. So if you're treating everybody the same, then generally you avoid those kind of complaints. So whatever specifications you're going to have, then you just have the same thing for everybody. You don't want to deny or provide less favorable services or facilities. Or even for example, even if you do have a facility, then obviously you want everybody have access to the same. If you have a weight room or pool or something, obviously everybody should have access to it if they're residents. So that's sort of, in a practical sense, how these things normally come up, and these are usually sort of the calls that we get as possible allegations of discrimination.
Yeah, thank you for sharing those examples. It definitely gives us a more concrete way of understanding exactly how discrimination can manifest in terms of housing. And you had mentioned the phrase protected class. Could you explain what a protected class is and what they are in Howard County?
Sure. So a protected class generally is a class of persons who are protected from discrimination. And so I'm going to start with, because the Fair Housing Act is federal law, so I'm going to start with the federally protected classes. So under federal law, the following groups are protected from discrimination. You can be protected based on your race, your color, your national origin, your religion, your sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, familial status. Familial status meaning including families with minor children or pregnant women, or disability. So those are the federally protected classes. And as we'll talk about a little later, both the state of Maryland and Howard County has some additional protected classes that, in addition to the federal protected classes. And so the Howard County Code, which is drafted and pretty much derived from the Fair Housing Act, it adds some additional protected classes other than the ones I've listed. and it allows us to investigate allegations of housing discrimination in a county.
Great, thank you for explaining that. And then you mentioned Howard County Code. What does the Howard County Code apply to as it relates to housing discrimination?
Sure. Well, like I said, the code is essentially derived from the Fair Housing Act. And what the code, so there's essentially 3 levels of jurisdiction. So there's local jurisdiction as far as Howard County, there's statewide jurisdiction, and then there's federal jurisdiction. So federal obviously is considered nationwide jurisdiction, and then there's statewide jurisdiction, and then there's local jurisdiction. Like, so for example, the Howard County Code essentially allows us to investigate allegations of housing discrimination that occur in Howard County. So we can't investigate an allegation of discrimination that occurred, for example, in Montgomery County. We don't have statewide jurisdiction. So, but if it occurred in Howard County, we have authority under the code to investigate those allegations of jurisdiction. If it occurred in Montgomery County, for example, then we may say, then you might want to contact the Maryland office for Maryland Commission for Civil Rights, because they have statewide jurisdiction. They can investigate any allegation of housing discrimination wherever it occurs in the state. And then obviously federal jurisdiction under HUD, Housing and Urban Development, they have authority to investigate any allegations of discrimination anywhere across the United States.
Okay, great. And then in terms of local jurisdiction, how does our office, the Howard County Office of Human Rights and Equity, enforce the Howard County Code here?
Sure. So essentially what we do is, like I said, so we have authority because of those protected classes to investigate any allegation of jurisdiction. What happens is, from a practical standpoint, is normally somebody may call us and allege that they've been discriminated against in some way as far as housing. Let's just say, for example, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, let's just say, for example, that they say that I was not allowed to rent, or I was told that I couldn't rent this place because I have a housing voucher. And so normally they would come to us, we would investigate it. So normally they would meet with myself or Mr. Logan, and we would basically draft a complaint for them, and we would send the complaint to the landlord, and then the landlord normally sends a response, and then we normally do a series of interviews or look at documents and try to determine whether or not there was an actual incident of discrimination. And whether there was, and I'll talk about that a little bit later as to where it might go as far as the next steps. But normally, if we do find that there is an allegation, if we do find that there was discrimination, as far as our investigation, it normally goes to the Howard County Human Rights Commission. There are also options for a person who's alleging discrimination to file in state or federal court as well. But like I said, our jurisdiction applies to if the incident occurred in Howard County, and if we find it, it goes to Human Rights Commission. But persons do have there are also options for filing in state or federal court as well.
Okay, thank you so much for explaining that. And then when we talk about these topics, there are usually certain vocabulary terms that come up. And so there are a couple that I wanted to ask about as well, in terms of what does disparate treatment mean?
Sure. So disparate treatment is essentially a legal theory. And basically you're trying to make a determination, I guess for the best way to put it is that you're treating somebody differently because he or she is a member of a protected class. And so essentially what happens is, for example, a landlord might refuse to rent to a family because the family is African American, or the landlord may refuse to rent to a family with children because they consider children to be too disruptive to other tenants. Or a real estate agent, for example, might steer prospective Hispanic home buyers to only Hispanic neighborhoods because they feel like the purchaser might be more comfortable. So again, so you're treating somebody differently because they're a member of a protected class. So that's essentially the legal theory behind disparate treatment. And so taking that out, if you take that out a little bit further, normally what happens is somebody will say, I'm in a protected class. Let's just say race, for example. And then normally they'll say, I applied for, or I was qualified to rent a place or purchase a place, and that my application was rejected. And let's say, for example, they rented to somebody outside of my protected class or another protected class. So that would be sort of the first step. And then normally what we would do is normally that landlord would say, once a complaint was filed, that landlord would normally contact us and say, this is what happened. Here is our legitimate non-discriminatory reason as to why we didn't rent to this person or why they were not able to purchase. And then we would have to look at whatever they supplied us and see if that was plausible and try to make a determination as to whether the person was discriminated against.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And then on a similar note, can you explain what disparate impact means?
Sure. Again, another legal theory, at least so far. I mean, there's some discussions as to whether that is going to continue to remain a legal theory, but as for right now, it is. But disparate impact is essentially considered a neutral policy or practice that, or at least on its face, a neutral policy or practice that could disproportionately impact a protected class. For example, and let's just say as an example, a landlord instituted a rule for their tenants that if any tenant who called 911 for emergency services more than 3 times in 6 months could be evicted. So it seems like on its face a neutral practice or policy, but it could have a disparate impact on women because most domestic violence victims are women. So even though again seems like a neutral policy or practice on its face, but it could have a disparate impact on a protected class.
Okay, I appreciate you explaining the meanings of these different theories and terms because it'll give us a better understanding as we continue the conversation. And I do want to ask a little bit about different complaints of housing discrimination. What is source of income as it relates to housing discrimination complaints?
All right, I'll take that question, Holly. Thank you so much.
Mhm.
So, what are sources of income? Immediately comes to mind are wages from employment. Now, keep in mind, these are wages from lawful professions only. We also have government assistance. Within that category, we have housing choice vouchers, VA housing vouchers, financial aid, Social Security, etc. Assets. We have retirements, gifts, property. Some people may own a home where they rent it, and that income is, that rental income is part of source of income. Someone also may own a machine, and they may use the machine to generate income. That could be source of income. We have annuities. When you have a fixed sum paid per year, usually for life, that's an annuity payment. Investments. Next, other income includes child support and alimony. And as far as source of income as it relates to housing discrimination, here at OHRE, we receive a lot of complaints where the complaining party feels like they've been discriminated against because they participate in a housing voucher. So I wanted to elaborate a little bit on one of the most popular housing voucher programs, which is the Housing Choice Voucher Program. So I'm going to go through a little bit of the elements of the Housing Choice Voucher Program, or the HCVP program. So first, it's a government program designed to assist very low income families to have safe, affordable, quality housing. It's administered by the local housing authorities. Next, the caps household housing expenses at 30 to 40% of income. For example, if the household income is $1,000 a month, their contribution towards that monthly payment will be capped at around $300 a month. Next, households are awarded a voucher for a specific number of bedrooms, usually based on the family size. Tenants have a limited amount of time to lease a unit before they lose their voucher. The housing provider or landlord signs a lease with a tenant and an agreement with the housing authority. Next, the units must pass a housing quality standard inspection, which is an inspection where they basically make sure the housing is safe for the family, and they're usually held annually. Next, the landlords may charge fair market rent. We sometimes have cases where landlords may try to increase the rent for a housing voucher holder, which is discriminatory. And we also have cases where sometimes a potential tenant may offer more than the fair market rent, which is also, not great when you're dealing with a housing voucher program. Last, the average wait time to receive a voucher in Baltimore City is 5 years. Moving forward, like I said, many of the housing discriminatory complaints we receive are related to housing voucher and source of income. So I also wanted to go over a lot of the common source of income discrimination in the leasing practices. First, we have advertising that the unit will not accept vouchers. This is a very common practice. Sometimes you see on the housing rental platforms like Zillow or Remax. In the description, landlords will list that not accepting vouchers. And that's a very discriminatory practice. And we try to reach out to them to explain that it is discriminatory and they should change or alter their listing to try to avoid, a complaint with our office. Next, telling someone that unit is off the market when it isn't. Sometimes we get complaints where, a potential renter who's part of a housing voucher program will contact the landlord and they'll tell them that, oh, my unit is off the market when, they can pull it up on any kind of website or, any kind of, advertisement. Moving forward, telling someone the unit won't pass the housing quality standard inspection. That is a discriminatory. Next, having a separate application process for voucher holders. We've had cases where sometimes when a potential applicant is a vouching holder, they may ask for additional information, which is discriminatory. Next, ghosting a prospective tenant upon revelation that they have a voucher. That's also very discriminatory and against the rules in the Howard County Code.
Okay, thank you so much for explaining that, Mr. Logan.
My pleasure.
Yeah, it gives us a good idea of things that truly impact even Howard County residents here. And in terms of housing discrimination complaints, if someone wants to file one, how long do they have to do so?
So in terms of housing discrimination complaints, they have 1 year, and I would like to read it directly from the Howard County Code. I'm reading from section 12.207, the complaint process. And I quote, filing of complaint, a person aggrieved by an alleged unlawful housing practice may file a complaint with the office within 1 year of the practice having occurred or terminated. The complaint may reasonably and fairly amend the complaint at any time. It's important to know that when you file a complaint, for example, if you felt like you were discriminated against based on your source of income, but as you think back, you also feel like there may have been some comments or some actions that also suggest that you were discriminated against based on your race, you can amend your complaint. But it's very important to file that complaint within that 1 year deadline.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. Very important. And I think it's also good for listeners to know that they can amend their complaint as well after the fact. Okay,
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And
Go ahead,
sorry,
Mr.
Holly, I just wanted to jump in for a second just to say too, as far as that source of income issue, that Howard County has always had source of income as a protected class. As far as possible housing discrimination claims. But recently, the Maryland General Assembly passed the Home Act of 2020. And so I'll just sort of give you a synopsis of what the Home Act was. And essentially it says expanding the housing policy of the state to include providing for fair housing to all citizens regardless of source of income, stating the act seeks to deconcentrate poverty by providing additional opportunities for tenants utilizing public subsidies to live in certain neighborhoods, prohibiting a person from refusing to sell or rent a dwelling to any person because of source of income, establishing qualifications and limitations on the prohibition against discrimination in housing based on source of income. So essentially what the Home Act did is add source of income for statewide. So like I said, Howard County already had source of income as a protected class, and now it's a protected class statewide as a result of the Home Act. So as Kevin already mentioned earlier, there's various sources of incomes. I mean, you can have child support and that can be a source of income. But usually what we find is a lot of times there's a certain stereotype regarding housing vouchers. And oftentimes we have found that a lot of complaints that we get is someone will say, I had a housing voucher and the landlord did not want to rent to me. And so now source of income is statewide as a protected class, where it was not always the case. For example, in other counties, you could put in your advertising that I don't want to rent to a housing voucher. So you can't do that anymore. You couldn't do that here in Howard County anyway, but now you can't do it statewide. So that's what the Home Act essentially did, is add source of income as a protected class. And so, and I said I was going to sort of circle back to protected classes in the fact that because the state of Maryland and Howard County has additional protected classes other than those are in federal law. So like I said, under federal law, you have race, you have color, you have national origin, religion, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, familial status, disability. But under the state of Maryland, you have additional protected classes such as marital status, gender identity, and now you have source of income. And then also under local jurisdictions, you have citizenship, which is a new one for Howard County. You have occupation, you have personal appearance, political opinion. So under our local law and under state law, there are some additional protected classes that are not found in federal law. And so the primary difference is if, for example, someone was filing a federal complaint, then you're limited to the ones that I read earlier as far as federally protected. Like, for example, you couldn't use citizenship as a protected class under a federal suit because that's not a protected class under federal law, even though it is under local law. So if you filed a claim in state court, then you might be able to use citizenship because it's considered to be a protected class under local law, but not federal law. So it is a difference. And generally, the state and the local laws have additional protected classes that aren't available under federal law. So that makes a difference depending on where somebody, if they were going to file a suit in court, where they were going to file in court. Like, for example, race is a protected class, whether it be under federal law or whether it be under state law or whether it be under the local law. But some of the protected classes are not recognized by all three branches.
That's really great information to share. Thank you, Mr. Givens.
Sure.
And so far today in our conversation, we've talked about filing complaints of alleged discrimination. But what happens exactly if someone is found to have engaged in housing discrimination?
Sure. So there are a couple different things that could possibly happen. So there's essentially judicial outcomes and administrative outcomes. So I'll just talk about our process a little bit. So essentially what happens is if someone files a complaint and we'll do our investigation, and after we do our investigation, we send written findings to all of the parties. And so essentially what we're going to find is either A, that there was no reasonable cause to indicate that they were discriminated against, or that there was cause to indicate that there was discriminated against. But keep in mind, we are the investigative agency, so we're not a judicial branch. So essentially, and I'll just start with track one. So if we found that, based on our determination investigation, that the person was not discriminated against, we would send out written findings to both parties. And in those findings, we indicate to the complaining party, the person that filed a complaint, that they have the opportunity to appeal our decision, or essentially ask Human Rights Commission if they want to hear it. And if the Human Rights Commission says, yes, we'd like to hear it, then it goes to them for hearing. If the Human Rights Commission says, no, we don't want to hear it, then that's the end of the process. And then the complaining party would have to decide whether they want to file a claim in either state or federal court, because they could still do that after our investigation is over. If after our investigation we found that the person was discriminated against, then under our code, it automatically goes to the Human Rights Commission, and they would hear the case. But when they hear it, they consider it to be de novo. In other words, they would essentially start from scratch, and they would take evidence and they would hear witness testimony and look at whatever documents, and they would not be bound by our findings. So they could either agree with us or they could disagree with us, and then whatever they decided essentially would be essentially what the outcome would be. So whether that would be a monetary fine or some other process, they would be the persons that would make that decision. We are somewhat involved in the process because we found that there was discrimination, so that gets it to Human Rights Commission to hear. But essentially, what we normally do is we strongly advise the complaining party to hire counsel, because ultimately the case is essentially still complaining party versus landlord. And because the Human Rights Commission is not bound by anything that we found, so essentially both parties are responsible for putting on their cases, and then HRC would essentially decide what to do with the case once they heard it. So that's sort of the tracks that we get. But then also persons do have, so that's why I said administratively, that's how it works as far as the code is set forth. There are also options for a complaining party to file in state or federal court. So if they do that, that wouldn't have anything to do with us. That's essentially because the court would have jurisdiction, and they're not asking us to investigate. They're filing a complaint in court, maybe making the same allegations, but they're not asking for an investigation. In our process, we do an investigation, submit written findings, and then the parties may wind up at Human Rights Commission, and then once it goes to Human Rights Commission, like I said, they hear the case de novo, start from scratch, if you will, and then they make a determination as to whether the person was discriminated or not. And if they think the person was discriminated against, they would make the determination as to whatever remedy would be.
Okay, thank you so much for walking us through that process, Mr. Givens.
Sure.
I think this is really important because sometimes people might not know what to do if they feel that they have been unlawfully discriminated against. So it's helpful for residents to know exactly what happens throughout this entire process.
Sure. And also what we tend to try to do is, and we do a little bit of outreach as well, as just, we don't just all investigate. We go to various places. We talk to landlords on occasion, and essentially we always advise the same thing. Just this is a compliance tip: standardize your policies and procedures. And so in other words, do you accept vouchers? Yes. And you just take your applications and you process them like you would process anybody else. There's really nothing any different. The only real difference is essentially where the money is coming from, because if you have a housing voucher, that means essentially HUD is paying a portion, but then the prospective tenant is still, in most cases, responsible for some of it anyway, as opposed to if I go and rent, I got to be responsible for all of it. But essentially the landlord's still getting paid. So essentially we tell the landlord, treat all the applications the same. You offer the same information regardless of source of income. If you have any specials, you advertise a special to everybody. So as long as you're essentially treating everybody the same, then that sort of gets you out of possible discrimination complaints. And that's usually what happens, because in the fundamental sense, it's usually somebody is alleging that they're being treated less favorably than somebody else. So we always tell landlords, if you do them all the same, then chances are you're not getting any complaints. And if you do get a complaint, you're probably going to be protected as long as you're treating everybody the same way.
Okay, and that is definitely a great tip to share. And so far today, we've talked a lot about what your unit does and what our office does. And this last question might be something that you get pretty often, but does our office assist with eviction prevention?
Unfortunately, we don't assist with eviction prevention. So, I mean, as far as if there's an issue with funds for eviction prevention, then usually agencies such as Community Action Council may be able to assist. If there are issues regarding landlord-tenant disputes about eviction, and normally legal aid can assist. But we're not equipped to or authorized to do eviction prevention. Essentially what we've sort of found when there have been complaints, generally there's normally 3 reasons that somebody might likely to be evicted. And so usually it's failure to pay, or a tenant holding over, which means that their lease has expired, but the tenant has not released the property, or a material breach of the lease. And a material breach of the lease, for example, let's say there's only 2 authorized occupants, but let's say the potential tenant may have 10 people in there, but that would be up to the landlord to basically prove that. But all of those instances, whether they're failure to pay, whether it's a tenant holding over, or whether there's a material breach of the lease, those are legitimate non-discriminatory reasons to possibly evict someone. So if there's an issue with that, I would, we normally advise a tenant to maybe contact legal aid, especially like, for example, if there's if the landlord is alleging breach of the lease, then the lease is normally spelled out what can and can't be done, and then court normally decides if there's a material breach of the lease or not. That's not something that we would do.
Okay, so thank you for sharing that. So even though we are technically not authorized to help with eviction prevention, there are other ways our office can help if you do feel that you have been unlawfully discriminated against.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so those are all the questions that I have, but to kind of end our conversation today, are there any last remarks or things that either of you would like to share with our listeners?
Well, sure. Well, first of all, I'm going to ask Kevin to tell everybody how they can reach us, because Kevin is like an intake person. So he's probably, when people do call, he's probably the first person they're going to get in contact with. So I'll leave him with that.
Absolutely. To reach our office, of course, you can dial our main line. The main number is 410-313-6430. We also have our website, www.howardcountymd.gov/OHRE. To file a complaint, we have an online inquiry portal. I'm going to go over the steps really quickly. You want to go to the website. Again, that's www.howardcountymd.gov/OHRE. Next, you would click how to file a discrimination complaint. Next, you would click filing a complaint. Then you would click the online inquiry form, which is a green button. Then you would simply just enter the information for your complaint. You can also visit the office. The address is 9820 Patuxent Woods Drive, Suite 237, Columbia, Maryland, 21046. Or you can contact me directly and I can take your complaint, or I could send you a link to the online complaint portal. Again, my name is Kevin Logan. My direct line is 410-313-6465. And my email address is klogan@howardcountymd.gov.
Perfect. Thank you so much for sharing the information, Mr. Logan. And so, again, we really hope that if there's any way that we can serve our community, assist you if you feel that you have been unlawfully discriminated against, please reach out to our office using the information that was just shared. I want to thank Mr. Givens and Mr. Logan for joining us today in recognition of National Fair Housing Month to talk about fair housing in Howard County and what residents can do here if they feel that their housing has been impacted by discrimination. So thank you to everyone who has been listening. We hope you have a great rest of your days. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having us on.